Hi, Lisa Marikosis, founder of Global One Health. This video is part 2 in the Animal Flow series. There'll be quite a lot of exercises and movements in Animal Flow to follow in the future, so stay tuned for those, but we are going in the progressional pattern that we would when you're teaching a client in the beginning of how to do the basic exercises and forms. So, the first video I addressed the wrist mobilizations, which is the first component that you should talk about and teach your clients in Animal Flow practice. So it is highly recommended that you do these mobilizations before you start your Animal Flow work. And even if you're doing just basic weight-bearing exercises, push-ups, planks, where you're going to be in that extended wrist position on the ground, I actually highly recommend doing the mobilizations to warm up the wrist joints. So just look at the first video in the Animal Flow series as I teach all of those and break them down for you. From the wrist mobilizations, the very next component in Animal Flow is the actual static activations. And in that first video, I also introduced the beast and crab activations. So this video is going to pick up where that left off, and we develop these static positions into the next component of Animal Flow, which is referred to as the traveling forms. So we're just going to take that beast and crab activation and develop it to travel forwards and backwards in space. So in my GFE GFE video, I did talk a lot about the hand position and how you actually want to activate your hand and your fingers very directly as to create more of a support structure for the wrist, elbow, and shoulder joints above it. So I'm not going to go into all that detail again in this video. So that would be in the GFE 6.4 crawl video. And I break down, because you want to keep in mind there is a specific way to activate your hand structure in any weight-bearing position. So that is the first real video where I really talked about that. But moving forward, you want to do that anytime your hands are in contact with the ground, don't have a flat hand position. You want to be kind of gripping the floor with the hands and fingers. So again, that breakdown of that explanation is in the GFE 6.4 cross lift and crawl video. So now go back to Animal Flow, and we're going to develop the beast activations into a traveling form. So now there's a slight specific difference with different approaches to crawling, whether you're doing ground force methods or Animal Flows or original strengths, right? So here we're going to talk about the specifics of Animal Flow. So you start in that static beast position. And as I mentioned, right, my hips are not directly over my knees. My hips are slightly shifted back a little bit more towards my lower leg. Notice my feet, they must be in dorsiflexion, right? You cannot crawl and lift up the knees in this pointed position. So I'm gonna have my feet dorsiflexed. Now if my ankles, just point out this, right? So if I just kind of put my toes down in any position, I have much less stability if my foot is kind of half pointed with the toes down, right? So don't let the ball of the foot get back away from you. Try to tuck, right? Get as much bend in the front of the ankle and really tuck the balls of the feet forward and under towards your shins as much as you can, so that it will also improve the dorsiflexion in your toe joints, which is very important for gait, right, for walking. So I'll just address the points, but we're not going to break them down here, right? So I'm gripping the floor, I'm corkscrewing my arms, as I've talked about before, which is very critically important when you're weight bearing, and my hips are back towards my lower legs. Now, the static beast is simply a lifting up. I'm going to go a little bit higher just so you can see, but you want to keep your knees no more than an inch off of the floor for the classic form of traveling beast crawls. So my knees are an inch off the ground. This is where those drills that I taught you in the other video are really, really important, right? I lift up one hand and one foot, and I place it slightly ahead. So I lift up the other hand and foot, and I place it slightly ahead. Notice a couple important points. My foot and hand come up at the same time. That's the opposite hand and foot. And they land lightly at the same time. I lift up one hand, one foot, and I move slightly forward. So I'm not trying to cover a big space, right? So in the classic breakdown, just to show you, right? So when one hand and one foot come down, I'm going to be in this position. So you'll notice the forward hand is slightly ahead of the shoulder. The back hand is slightly behind the opposite shoulder. The same thing with the knees. When I crawl forward, right, I don't allow my knee to touch that wrist. There is a little bit of space in between. That's classic form, right? So again, this shoulder is, right, slightly different relationship, right? My shoulder is behind my wrist, and this wrist is ahead of the wrist. Ahead of the shoulder. Okay, so that would be, we'll do that one more time. I lift and land together. Good. Now the same holds true for the backward crawl. I lift up and I land. I lift up and I land. So again, I'm not covering. Now backwards, it's a little bit harder to maintain spacing. So do be mindful to not, when you're going back, overreach or overextend that leg too far back, right? I notice that on clients much more so in the backwards direction of the crawl than I do in the forward. So again, just try to think of just lift up slightly. Lift and land. Lift and land. Lift and land. And then I'll go forward one more time. Lift and land. Lift and land. Lift and land. Okay. So that is the beast forward and backward crawl in animal flow. And now we're going to get to the crab. Same thing. So in crab, you start in your static. Actually, we'll start here. So we're going to start in the crab activation, right? So reviewing crab, feet are flat into the ground. I'm pressing that tripod of my foot into the floor and all 10 toes. My fingertips ideally are facing backwards away from my body. I am in a neutral spine and lean back. You want to make sure that when you lift your hips up, you don't lift up your hips and round your lower back. You want to make sure you are in an anterior pelvic tilt. So just to quickly review that. So this would be a posterior pelvic tilt. I'm rounded and tucked under. You do not want to do this in crab. So you want to have that natural arch in the lumbar, which is referred to as a little bit of an anterior position, not a posterior or tucked position. So my hands into the ground. I want my shoulders open and back. I'm packing my shoulders. Elbows slightly bent so I don't lock out my joint. I'm looking not straight ahead, but a little bit up. Just a quick review of that crab activation. Same exact premise. I lift up one hand and the opposite foot. Right, one hand, opposite foot. Right, I keep looking in a forward direction. Very important here, I am not shifting from side to side. Same premise, not trying to overreach too far behind me. So from a front view, it's very important that you're not shifting. So as I lift up one hand, one foot, I'm going to break down the hand and foot patterning in a moment, but just that you can see, ideally, I am traveling as if I was inside a narrow tube or tunnel. I'm going forwards and backwards directly. Right? If you're shifting, then you're defeating the whole. One of the primary purposes is that static isometric positioning of the trunk relationship, right? Of the relationship to the shoulders to your hips. So you do not want to practice the shifting. So you're not crawling just for the sake of crawling for a minute for endurance. If you're shifting back and forth, the whole technique of the crawl is incorrect, right? So you don't want to practice that pattern over and over again, then it's going to be harder to break that habit. So that's why I always go back to your activations, just the single foot, single hand, and then single hand, single foot together. Own that, and then you can, right, so crawling is a progression. So if you can do the isometric static activations very well without shifting, then you're ready to progress to the crawling. So don't progress before your body or your joint structures are ready or you have the muscular strength to do it. Then you're just training the body to develop compensations, which will be harder to break in the long run. So a couple little important points with the crab position that you want to try to, like these are smaller details, but they're talked about in the certification. Now your foot, whether you're going forwards or backwards, can land in a flat foot position, meaning the whole foot touching together. At the same time, if I'm crawling forward, if you can think and add this component, it is a little detail that you can add in if you're ready for it. When you crawl forward in crab, right, you're trying to, right, ideally is in the same way if you would walk, right? Your heel would hit the ground first, right? And then you would drop the ball of the foot. The backwards would be the opposite. If you can get that slight pattern of ball, heel, ball, heel, ball, heel. So you're trying to mimic what would happen in gait, right? And if you were to walk backwards, your ball would hit before your heel, which is the opposite of forward. So if you can add that little component in the forward back crab crawl, go for it. Ideally, also, the hands do the same thing. So when I lift up my hand, I could place it down, but ideally I would try to go fingers to the palm, fingers to palm, fingers to palm. I'll just make it a little bit bigger so you can see it. Another backward, which is even harder, I would try to go palm fingers. So palm fingers, palm fingers. A little hard to see, but all right, I'm trying to go this way with my hands in the forward crawl and then right in the back. So I'm still trying to use the hand and foot structure with that slight bit of extra focus on articulation. So that is a little bit more of an advanced component, but I mention it because it is in the classic explanation when you're learning the traveling forms in the certification. So I do want to talk about those. Important, one other thing with the crab, you don't want, right, to lift up the shoulder in either the forward or backward crawl. So it should not look like, right, the arm staying straight. So don't try to keep the arm straight, because then in order to clear the floor, the shoulder comes up and then I'm losing the activation of that lateral posterior side of my ribs, which is very important. I want to keep those engaged. So I bend my elbows slightly, whether I'm crawling forwards or backwards. So it's a slight bend of the elbow, not a raising of the shoulder joint or the shoulder girdle, which includes the scapula, the shoulder blade in the back. So keep those shoulders packed. Again, that is video 4. I think it's such an important premise, which is why I made a video just talking about how to pack your shoulders. So this is a perfect example of, right, the crab traveling forms are a good example as to why you want to learn how to pack your shoulders so that you're using those muscles in the mid-back to activate, to support the shoulder joints in weight-bearing position. So that is a very important component. So I highly recommend do the traveling forms. The traveling forms can be done slowly, a slow crawl. They can be done for time. So set your timer once you build up the proper form and technique. If you want to use them as a cardio interval in the middle of a workout, that's a fantastic drill that you can do. So I recommend that, and that is great for metabolic conditioning. Crawling really is one of the best exercise drills that you can use, like in intervals, or just set your timer for 5 minutes when you've built up that endurance. So it's great for metabolic condition, as I just mentioned. Traveling forms and the crawls are also good as a warm-up, right? You're just kind of, it's not a fancy big movement, but it's just enough. You're getting very good loading of the joint structures, right? You're loading your hips, your legs, right? Your shoulder joints, your leg muscles, right? All the muscles that support the shoulder girdle. So it could be used as a warm-up. It can even be used as a recovery or a cool-down. So pick and choose how you choose to use crawling or in what context, but it's great for all of the above. And also, again, I mentioned, right, anytime you're doing cross-body patterning, right, opposite arm and leg, you are definitely doing a good service for your nervous system and good brain training for the CNS, right, the central nervous system. So that concludes this video for the traveling forms of beast and crab activation, beast and crab crawling in the forward and backwards direction.